Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the North American Association of Cerebral Palsy Advocates Chatline. My name, of course, is Caleb Wells. I am the founder and chairman of the North American Association of Cerebral Palsy Advocates, and we are joined again today by my partner in crime, Tanner Lynn. How are you today, Tanner?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Um, Board member Brittany Smith, how are you?
I'm doing great.
And then our great friend and advocate, author, jack of all trades, Tylia Flores. How are you today, Tylia?
I'm great.
So, thank you guys so much for coming back on the show. I know last time we got together about 2 weeks ago, we were starting our series on disability history and the history of the independent living movement. So we're going to build off of that. If you haven't listened to that first episode, you have to remember that all of our episodes are cataloged, and there is a backlog of stuff on YouTube, Spotify, all of those podcast directories as well. And so today we're going to talk about Judy Heumann, who may, after talking about Ed Roberts last time, who kind of was the spearhead, the start of the disability movement in Berkeley, California. We're going to go to the opposite coast and meet a young woman named Judy Heumann. But before we do that, Tanner, what do we need to do?
We need to thank a great sponsor.
Our great friends over at Giraffe Battle. Summer is over, friends, and back to school is around the corner. Go back to school in style with the Giraffe Bottle hands-free hydration system. The Giraffe Bottle Power Bundle starts at $57 at giraffebottle.com. That is giraffe, like the animalbottle.com. The bundle, as always, includes a 24-ounce stainless steel giraffe bottle, a 15-inch neck straw, and that mount to mount it wherever needed. The giraffe bottle is great for people of all abilities. Hands-free hydration system makes it easy to hydrate on the go. Great solution for walkers, wheelchairs, desks, beds, tables, and more. Go back to school without the fear of dehydration with the Giraffe Bottle. If you order before September 1st, get free shipping on all orders over $75 at giraffebottle.com. Once again, that is giraffe, like the animalbottle.com. Thank you to our friends at Giraffe Bottle for sponsoring the chat line. Let's get into this episode today. So we left off in the early to mid 1970s last time, in 1972 with Ed Roberts. And before we totally wrap that all up, does anybody have any thoughts about our last episode or anything like that?
I have a thought. I think Ed Roberts, along with Judy Heumann, he was the person that started the movement for us to start advocating for a better, more inclusive, and less ableist place.
Exactly. We talked last time, right, about Berkeley kind of being this Garden of Eden, for lack of a better phrasing, for people with disabilities, kind of this promised land. But Judy Heumann was born on the East Coast. She was born in New York, and at 2 years old, doctors suggested that she be institutionalized so that her parents could, quote, be done with all the disability entails. Her parents never wanted to do that, and she was surprised what her dad told her at age 36. Um, Judy was also one of the first who went to school in New York, and she wasn't allowed to go to school until she was about 7 years old. And does anybody know why she wasn't allowed to go to school? This is
Because
kind of a well-known story.
I know why, because they didn't have enough accessibility for her, and the ADA didn't exist, and there was no 504 plan.
Exactly.
Yes.
And the school district called her, quote, a fire hazard. So
Yeah, which
That's horrible. No.
could you imagine, like, one of us going into a building and being told, well, you can't be here because you're a fire hazard?
Actually,
That,
I was
that'd be
told
it.
that when I first started going to UCP and I didn't have a wheelchair, and my mom would have to bring me in the stroller, but they advocated for me to get a wheelchair, and they gave me the resources in New York.
Yeah. And you know what's a fire hazard? It's not a person. A person is not a fire hazard.
nope.
An open flame is a fire hazard.
Exactly.
So, you
So the fact that Judy was told she's a fire hazard is completely ridiculous because no.
so as we go along here, she eventually did get into school, and she graduated high school from New York public schools, and then she moved to Berkeley around that same time that we ended the last episode. So she moves to Berkeley, she gets her degree from UC Berkeley, and so she goes on and she starts all of these great things. She goes back to New York, starts advocating in the state of New York, and then in 1974, she was the one who organized the 504 sit-in with Ed Roberts in San Francisco. And so, who wants to take the 504 sit-in? Because I'm sure
I'll,
people are tired of hearing of my voice. Who wants
I'll
to go?
take the 504 city. So Judy organizes the 504 plan, and as her brother said at her funeral, she tricked the Washington officials. She told the Washington officials, "Oh no, we're not gonna go do a sit-in," but she sure went in there and did that sit-in, and she grinned, and it lasted for about 2 days, if I'm not mistaken. Right,
Yeah.
Milo?
Yes, it was 2 days.
It was like 72 hours.
Yep.
Yeah.
So almost 3 days. And what's funny about that is not only did she trick the officials in Washington about that, and she talks about that in a lot of her interviews later on in life, that she was kind of a Washington inside outer, is how she put it, is she really enjoyed the fact that she was able to infiltrate all that, but she was never going to be like a politician. And then in 2011, of course, she went on to work for the Secretary of State and did that until 2018. But back to 1974, she goes to San Francisco, and in San Francisco, they have basically an inaccessible building that houses the California Department of Education. And what they were protesting, like you said, Tylia, was for State Act 504, which would have given educational protections to those with physical, intellectual, and emotional disabilities. Eventually, that evolves into Title II of the ADA. And so they're in there for 72 hours. They tried to get them out. the American Alliance of the Deaf came and joined the sit-in as well. And so they had representatives there as well. And they had no water in this building because the city of San Francisco cut off all the water. So if you wanted to shower, you had to leave, but you couldn't go back into the building. You had to go to the bathroom in the sink. They basically brought their own food, and they basically made a camp, much like the Greenboro sit-ins during the civil rights movement for African Americans, which, when you look at these things from a historical perspective, you look at the African American civil rights movement, you look at the gay rights movement, you look at the independent living movement, they all kind of work in concert with each other, right? If Martin Luther King and the Little Rock 7 and those things didn't happen, this 504 sit-in doesn't happen. And if the 504 sit-in doesn't happen, the Capitol crawl doesn't happen, which we'll get to here in a minute.
Remember when they blocked the buses?
Oh yeah, in New York City.
Yeah.
In New York City, that was crazy.
Yeah, they linked basically wheel and wheel and blocked a main thoroughfare in Manhattan to protest bus accessibility in the 1980s. So, long story short, Judy Heumann was a badass.
Yeah, she was a badass. She was fierce.
I know this is a family-friendly show, but I think we can all four of us can agree here. And as an educator, and as someone who is an educator in special education, my entire career is thanks to Judy Heumann and Ed Roberts for saying, you are going to educate us, and if you can't, we're going to find somebody who can. So that's just my thoughts on it. There's so much more that we can dive into with Judy Heumann, but I'm going to turn it over to you guys for a minute.
I think for me, with my career as a disability rights journalist and activist, she paved the way for me to share my voice with the world through my literature and my articles and my writing. And for that, I have to thank her. And I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional. I really miss her.
Yeah, and it's okay to get emotional on this show. We know I've gotten emotional on this show, and Tylia, we talk about that stuff, right? Is she did all this great stuff in her life, and then she passed away in March of 2023. And so, and not to get super religious or anything on the show either, we all are given a plan on this planet, right? We're not just floating orbs in the universe. I think everybody can agree on that. Yeah. And my thought is, until your story is written, it's not your time to go. And her story has been written. It has been. It's not that we can't build off of that as advocates, right? As people who live in this shadow. She was the first. She was probably the most vocal. Again, like we said with Ed Roberts, he didn't find a microphone he didn't like. Judy Heumann definitely did not find a microphone she didn't like. She loved every microphone, everything, every camera. She never shied away from that. And I think that's one of the things here. And it wasn't a fame seeking thing for her either, right?
Mhm.
And I think we all have to remember that is, yes, she was vocal. Yes, she was very much a forward thinker, but it wasn't in the case to be a super self-serving thing.
Yes, it was. It was to get, the way I see it, it was to help other people get the word out and get what they need, and not just for herself.
Exactly. That's honestly that's what I love about Judy Heumann is that um she not only spoke up for herself but every individual that was around her, because if it wasn't for her, the ADA wouldn't be in place and there wouldn't be like accessible, things,
I agree there. I'm sorry. I'm still emotional, but Judy Heumann paved the way so that we could be the advocates we are today. And like I said, I just miss her because I know there's not gonna be no one like Judy Heumann. She deserves to be where Abraham Lincoln is in the White House.
So, and I'm not going to starve myself. I find that I'm a very good advocate. I don't think I could go on hunger strike. I don't think I have enough built up fat for that. But I'm just, and I don't mean to be cracking jokes, but I'm being serious. It's like, it takes a lot of resolve to be that person.
Yep, to be that voice, really, it takes a lot.
And
I mean,
Tylia, go ahead, Brittany. Sorry.
to me, like that that in itself, her getting like the ADA established, that shows you right there how much how do you put it, willpower, and like she pushed for like the ADA and accessibility.
And
To me, that's a strong individual right there.
when we talk about the ADA, and we could do a completely separate episode on the impact of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we might explore that towards the end of this series. Hell, I wrote a 200-page paper on it. We look at that piece of it. It was all these hunger strikes, everything that she did, the sit-ins, the talks, everything that was being set forth in the 70s. It was creating this firestorm that ended in the late 1980s and into the early part of the 1990s. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, as it's written, is not perfect. There hasn't been a major amendment to the ADA since 2002. That's 21 years by my count. I'm not good at math.
Yeah,
But
that's 21 years, way too long. And there's so many things that have changed about the world. Society's always changing, and that's why we have to find new ways to make the world less ableist, more inclusive, and create the conversation of being disabled is okay. It's not something that you should sin upon, or say, oh, or use awful alternative wording to describe a child or an adult with a disability.
Exactly.
E-
Exactly.
Exactly.
Agree with you.
And we look at these things. I love what you said there, Tylia. The world is evolving. We look at this now, and I promised I wouldn't talk about this when I talked to you, Tanner, the other day when we were talking about our ADA episode. I told you I wasn't going to talk about WCAG, but here we go. So the big piece of legislation that's being tossed around right now, and the thing that Judy was working on most recently with the National Federation of the Blind, as well as the American Alliance of the Deaf and United Cerebral Palsy, all those organizations, was a thing called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. To break this down into the simplest of terms, is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is a list of guidelines of how to make websites accessible. The only thing that is preventing it from being a federal law at this point is that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines were written by a private group. They were written by a group of professors and advocates from Utah State University. So, in the spirit of that, and in the spirit of the United States government, almost 300 years running, we have this perfectly good set of a baseline, a guideline. But because the government didn't write it, it's not good enough. And we can't pass it into law.
And that's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. And that is why you're seeing cases like Robles versus Domino's, which was a blind guy who sued the Domino's Corporation because he couldn't order a pizza because they wouldn't take his call over the phone and they had to use the online website. However, it was not accessible through his screen reader.
It's still not accessible when I go on there.
Oh, Domino's website is awful. Their app is awful, but then
Do better, Domino.
Yeah.
Last time you brought my pepperoni pizza with no cheese.
Are you serious?
I'm dead serious. I had to call them to get me a pizza with cheese. Luckily, they were right across the street, but that's a story for another time.
Oh, so you get these things, and the Americans. Go ahead, Tylia.
Not even their tracker is accessible now that I think about it.
Oh, their tracker is not accessible to neurotypical able-bodied people.
Not at all.
So, we look at these things and we pull this out, and the ADA is great. As I like to say, better than nothing. However, reasons why amendments are not being made to the ADA. There are two reasons. One is it's not a priority to the U.S. government. Two, it is protecting lawyers who litigate ADA law. They will actively lobby against fixing the loopholes in ADA law so they can sue people.
Yeah, it's true. That's like I've been emailing Biden and Camila for years about the ADA, and I get no response from them, even my state officials.
Yeah, you can start at the local level. We can start at the state level. Luckily, here in Missouri, we've been very lucky to get people at the state level who really want to make a difference. And we've pushed forward with that. Again, it's not perfect, but it's something. We really are transitioning, and we've been in this transitional phase, I guess, for about 15 years. After, there was 15 years after the ADA was passed, 12 years after the ADA was passed, the amendment passed. 13 years ago, they put in the guidelines for ramps and building accessibility.
Yeah, and that's still an issue. Like my downtown, Claremont, I can't get into certain establishments because they're not accessible.
And you want to know why? Because when you look at the Physical Barriers Act of 2010, if you read the fine print in paragraph G, it technically only applies to federal, state, and government buildings.
Yeah, it doesn't apply to businesses, and it should.
Yes.
Exactly.
And luckily, there are states around the country where they have adopted a version of the Physical Barriers Act. And the argument to that, and I don't mean to get super political here, and we can wrap this up soon. I don't mean to get super political here, but the thought, like the school of thought, is through Title III of the ADA, which is the rights to goods and services. It's written in such a way that it's so open for interpretation that everybody tries to fight it. And again, going back to the thought of the lawyers, that's why they don't want to fix it, because they have these lawyers who study ADA law, but they study the loopholes in ADA law. They offer a bunch of money in class action lawsuits to a bunch of different people and don't actually fix the problem. And that is a societal issue. That clearly tells me where, as a society, we stand on this issue. And it breaks down to where everything else breaks down, as people see a way to make money off of it, which capitalism is great, don't get me wrong. But when you're doing that at the expense of my livelihood is when I take issue with that.
Exactly. And
Exactly.
we can have a whole episode on the ADA, but yeah.
And Tylia, before we wrap up, you had one more thing to say?
I just want to say that when it comes to Judy Heumann, she was a fierce badass that passed on the torch to us, and her funeral was amazing. I watched the whole thing.
And that's still up on YouTube, right?
I think so.
Yeah, I'll find it and I'll link it in the podcast notes as well if you want to go learn more, because her brother said some pretty amazing things. But
we should get her brother on this podcast, maybe.
If we could do that, that would be even better. So
yes, that would be great.
Yeah,
that would be really neat.
We might work on that, because we got some guests lined up here in the next few weeks that we got to line up. So again, Tanner, take us home, bud.
If you're watching this podcast on YouTube, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. If you want to hear more episodes, there's a whole back catalog on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. So thank you for listening to this episode, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Yep. Thank you for joining us. wherever you are joining us, however you are joining us, thank you for making us part of your week. Again, Tylia and Brittany, thank you for joining us again. I love doing this. I love education. I know it got a little bit more political than we thought, but thank you guys. And
Not a problem.
yeah,
You're welcome.